This is the on-site interview in reference to JTA RFP number P-19-025, State Government Affairs Services. As this is an interview, we do encourage any dialogue, any questions that you may have at any time. So we want it to be an active conversation between the two parties. My name is Darren Parker. I'm the Contract and Procurement Specialist, and we'll introduce the rest of the committee.
Ivan Rodriguez, Director of Government Affairs.
Jessica Schupler, Assistant Vice President of Public Affairs.
Richard Clark, Capital Resource Officer.
Hey, Brian, did you hear the introductions?
I did.
Okay.
Hey.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes. Hey, Brian. Thanks for joining us by phone. I know these interviews were somewhat last minute, so appreciate you making time for us.
No, we appreciate it. It's been an honor representing you guys. And I know many of you know Johnny, who's in front of you, and Matt. I don't know if you guys have had the opportunity with Matt Forrest before, but they are two of our top guys in our Tallahassee office. I'll just briefly talk about the firm and let those guys answer the specific questions, and I'll be available for questions as well. But our firm has been around for a little over 20 years. We're the largest firm in Tallahassee as far as revenue goes. I think probably the largest as far as total number of clients and lobbyists. And I want to talk about conflicts in a second, but not right now. Let me get through some of the description of the firm. We are a firm that prides ourselves on having folks who have expertise in government, not just politics of the government. We're still very actively involved in politics, but guys like Johnny serve at senior levels of the legislature. I was chief of staff to a governor, and if you go through, our firm's partners' resumes, you'll see everything from a former attorney general on down. So we do believe our firm distinguishes itself from our vast experience in government before turning to lobbying. As far as lobbying goes, I think hopefully you've seen this working with us in the past, that we're diligent, ethical folks who really do everything we can to get the right answers for our clients, get the issues addressed in the appropriate way. We value our clients' reputations. We value our reputation enhancing their reputation. So it's something that's really important to us. I know I'll talk a little bit about the conflict issue because we are a big firm, and sometimes I remember when we started out and we were a little firm, I would always say to guys we were competing against, well, they have too many issues, they have too many potential clients or potential conflicts that come with having the size that when we were starting, the guys that were the big guys. Now that we're the big guys, it's always stuck in my head. It's always been something I wanted to make sure wasn't an issue, and that's why we have so many lobbyists, where we basically break down our representation into groups and subgroups. And whenever a new client comes in, we do a thorough conflict check. We do not take the client if it's a conflict with another client without specific permission of the existing client. And then if there is a matter that rubs up against that client, we won't involve ourselves in it, or we won't take the client. And we've had that practice for a very long time. No one has ever accused our firm of not working diligently and effectively for our clients. So the size and the number of clients we have sometimes can be off-putting for some folks, but please understand we have the resources and the team to tackle any issue. Even though it's just me and Johnny and Matt today, you will have at your fingertips the entirety of our firm and all the partners in Tallahassee. So I'll let the fellows there talk more, but I just wanted to address that issue and just say a little bit about the firm. So thank you, guys.
Well, guys, thank you. As you know, I've been involved with JTA for now since going back to 2011. Our first session was, is he getting off? I was enjoying the music while I talked. Brian, are you still on?
I'm not. I'm sorry. We're having phone issues in DC. I apologize. So if there was music playing, I apologize.
Well, again, I have really enjoyed the last 8 years with you guys. We've worked hand in hand. We talked often, and I took myself back to early on, and one of our first task, if you will, was you were having some trouble with some financial disclosure statements. You remember where we had to take you back to prior to '09 when you got drug into some, handling the long forms as opposed to the short forms. And so we fixed that issue for us. That was a big deal for your board because you were having some problems with, recruiting, retaining the right people. So the financial disclosure was our first big task. And it was complicated in a way because we had Barbara Peterson, the Amendment 4 group, and all those folks that were, chasing issues like that. So it was kind of highlighted, and we had to do that with the most discretion that we could, and it worked. We had heavy involvements in the St. John's Ferry. As you know, my history with the committee goes way back with the St. John's Ferry. We once called it the Mayport Ferry, and so, the fact that we've got two appropriations. First one was $1 million, one for 1.5. Unfortunately, one got vetoed and got wrapped up into, local and whether it's a local issue, and so that stuff happens in the process when you start balancing the appropriations bill. But then we've been heavily involved with New Starts, working with DOT for New Starts with your bus rapid transit. We've been involved in U2C with your autonomous vehicles, working with Brandis, working with Fisher, working with all the people that's involved in innovative technology around the Capitol. But I want to touch on question number 4, which is, I'm going to dive right into it on why we're the best. If you take a look at the list I just gave you at the staff, Brian mentioned the number of staff that we have. If you'll notice, we have all types of backgrounds. We have legislators, we have ex-staffers, we have chief of staffs. Brian was the chief of staff under Martinez. We have a staff member that was the chief of staff for the lieutenant governor. We have aides to legislators. We have all forms of backgrounds. My background is with both the Appropriations Committee and the Policy Committee. And if you'll think about it for just a second, what the legislative process is all about, they only do 2 things. That's appropriate money and they develop policy. And on the surface, that sounds real simple, but when you throw in the people, so to speak, and the people can take any format you want to characterize as. Mostly, let's talk about lobbyists and their influence. As Brian said, we're one of the largest, one of the most influential lobby firms in the state, and so we have a long list of people that we in the process that we work with. But the footprint of my experience is understanding exactly the steps through the process. We understand the steps of a staff director. We understand the steps that was taken as a legislator. There's 2 different aspects of background there. One is an elected official. One is a staffer that goes through the process of handling issues objectively. But one thing that characterizes the difference in those 2 personalities, if you will. One's elected, and one is a source of information to that legislator. And there's a certain trust there that you go through in the process. So I want to make a point that we understand the process, we understand the dynamics of how the staff and the legislator works, and so that is an important issue in the process, and we've talked about it many times, Ivan, about you've worked in Puerto Rico, you worked in the legislative process, and you understand the relationship between staff and the legislator. So that's an important point, that's an important part of what we do. I want to touch a little bit on giving you some examples of maybe some, and Matt's going to touch on it too, about some issues that arise maybe from if if you call it a conflict, or if you call it a different point of view, whether you call it issues that different sides, like an industry versus a local government. We work within our client base to make sure those conflicts or those issues are solved in the process. Matt's going to touch a little bit on those issues from a local government. We have found that in the local government process, those issues and differences come up quite often because, you know, if you look at all the bills that go through the process, most of them involved every aspect of local government, and there's going to be some various interests involved. There's going to be the private sector, there's going to be the local perspective, and so we have worked through the process to make sure that nobody loses within our client base, because we have winners and we have losers, and so we don't want to win at the expense of a loser. So Matt will give you an example of when that type of thing happens.
It's a pleasure to be here with you guys today. I know I've done a few of these on the other side of the table, and I know it's a long day, so I hope you get more than just that little candy bar for lunch. That's a fun size even, so that's not even a full meal. But it's a pleasure to be here. My background is in local government. Like Johnny and Brian said, I did come from the government sector, but not through the Tallahassee world. At the same time, I've been with Brian and with the firm since 2007. So I do a lot of local government work through our practice, most notably down in Palm Beach County. And I think this question on the conflict issue, and it kind of segues a lot also into your questions 2 and 3 in regards to the size of our firm and our client base, and also then how that works into the relationship game and how we know these legislators. So for starters, we represent 5 cities in one county, Palm Beach County. And I think I got questions right out of the gate from all of those, even though we've represented them now for over a decade, all of them, that, you know, how are you going to, one, weigh the interests of our needs versus the town 5 miles down the road, but then also against all the other interests that you represent at Ballard Partners, corporate, or even from the state standpoint. And really, when it comes down to it, conflicts are usually based on a single issue and not an overall general philosophy. If you obviously look at the League of Cities, there's not much they like, right? There's an issue on almost everything that gets filed. But if an individual city, they would say, you know, that's not a huge priority to us. That's not a huge issue for us. And so before we take on any client, we would talk about that in particular issue and say, how does this relate to our specific cities? Is this a big issue for you? If so, then we're not going to take this client. Rarely has it been an issue. In fact, I can't think of a single time where a city said, no, don't take Uber on as a client because we have too big an issue. In fact, a lot of times with issues like that, it was, yes, go fix this issue because we can't solve it on our own. And a lot of times those cities will also look at us and say, oh, I'm so glad you have a seat at the table. Here's the main issue we have with it. If these companies would just do X, Y, Z, we'd be much happier with the bill. And so instead of, from a League of Cities standpoint, where we just go, oh, we don't like this, we're opposed to it, we're more strategic and specific on the individual issues for our clients. And of course, knowing, again, we keep track of this ahead of time, we talk about it, everything above the board, and of course, before we take on any client. Because we also want a win for both. We also don't want to get hired by a company and they find out later, well, we got to recuse ourselves 6 months in because some other client didn't like us. And so it's important for our record, it's important for our clients, like Johnny said, for both to win and be successful. With that said, I've also found a lot of value in the fact that we represent multiple clients and multiple issues within a geographical area or even in a particular silo. We are obviously a tremendous resource to our clients. Hopefully we are a resource to you. If we're not, then you guys are wasting your money. But we're also a resource to the legislators. There's a finite amount of time in a given day. There's a finite amount of given time in committee weeks, and even a more finite amount of time in a legislative session. Even though it's 60 days, let's face it, it comes down to about 40 days, and every minute counts. We see these legislators all the time because we have a variety of clients and issues to see them with. I can't tell you how many legislators will pass me in the hallway and say, Matt, we need to catch up after work. I have 5 things I need to talk to you about from that area. As opposed to maybe a smaller firm lobbyist that has one particular issue, they don't have an occasion to go possibly see that chair any given day. And at the same time, it's not necessarily a resource for that chair to have to reach out to that one issue. whereas one meeting with us can solve several different questions, several different problems. So that kind of segues, if you want. I know we've been talking for a while. I'll let you guys maybe answer your questions and make sure we're covering some things. And if you want, then we can dive into questions 2 and 3 and talk to you more about how we do things, our strategies, and how we're successful.
One of the issues that I've ever had a so-called conflict with is, if you remember, when the Uber and Lyft types of technology that came around, we had some issues with local government, we had issues with taxi cabs, but at the time I was representing airports, and one of the things that they wanted to do is have absolutely a designated area for these guys to gather in. So we carved out a specific exemption, if you will, for Uber and Lyft, so that the airports and also the ports could have a designated area for security reasons for those guys to pick up passengers and to carry on. So to follow up on Matt's point, we if they're an existing client, because we represented Uber as well, you know, we make sure that we don't have a loser for you, if you will, a winner. So that's another example of where we work to make sure that both of our clients are satisfied in the process. Another thing that I wanted to mention, and to segue from what Matt said, is that we want to be a resource. And I feel like we have done that. If you'll remember that we've had a lot of work with the Department of Natural Resources with respect to the Volkswagen issue, which is going to be a giant issue when they start divvying up the money through the process. And I think you guys are involved right now with a request for information for the Volkswagen issue. So hopefully we've kept you informed on that issue along the way. I have tried to be a resource for the medical marijuana issue, which is coming down for, you know, possibly to take a look at for, you know, human resources type things like bus drivers. And so the work program, the DOT work program, as far as new starts, you know, keeping you guys up to date on what's going on and how the money is so-called allocated through the process for the work program, for new starts and small starts, and that's a federal program, as you know, and you've got significant money out of the BRT, out of the work program for BRT, and then, of course, you're using your local gas option, gas tax for, you know, matching funds for those things as well. So I think that the director's vision for connectivity for the various modes of transportation has resonated through the transit world, whether it's walking, biking, scooters, transit, driving, you know, whatever the various modes. He has made it his vision to make sure that you have an interconnected system in your process. I always look back at the law 349, which establishes the JTA. I always envisioned that as the regional concept. As you know, we worked on the regional concept here with Representative Cummings, Chairman Cummings. He carried that issue for you, and we supported the regional concept in this area, which has been, I think, a good thing as far as I can see. Your transportation center, I passed by it on the way in. That's looking really good, and I've been heavily involved, as you know, on the Greyhound side to try to, you know, facilitate some of the, you know, personnel in that area to try to put people together and make sure that the old Greyhound station went for economic development, and we could try to start, you know, putting a network where transportation could gather in one place. So, you know, I think transportation as a whole is moving toward innovation and transformation. Autonomous vehicles, we have supported Brandis, and we've supported Fisher, and we've supported Jamie Grant. Those are our primary contacts for innovation, and those are the go-to guys, so to speak, for things that are going on in the autonomous vehicle world. We have specific legislators that kind of, not necessarily specialize in things. We have some go-to guys, though. We have some go-to guys for transportation. We have some go-to guys for innovation. And of course, Brandis, and we have met with Brandis at least a couple, 3 times to keep him apprised of what's going on relative to the UTC and relative to the bus rapid transit. So hopefully we're a good resource for you for both transportation and non-traditional transportation issues.
Thank you, Brian, Matt, and Johnny. Really appreciate it. Johnny, you know, you're probably one of the hardest working consultants that we have as it relates to our state issues, and so you are certainly very proactive about keeping us informed on what's going on over in Tallahassee when obviously we're not there as much. And so really appreciate that and your support over the years. One of the questions that I have and just would like to hear from you, whether it be Brian, whoever it may be, we've got a couple of big projects coming up over the next couple of years. U2C obviously is one of them that you mentioned. We also are in the very early discussion, which U2C we estimate is probably going to be around, once it's fully built out, which is the 10-mile system, it would be around $300 million total. And obviously we've been very successful over the years at getting federal grants, and obviously the state match is a part of, a part of the funding that we need to match what we get from the feds. And we've had success in, working with the FDOT over the years, thanks to our good team at securing those matches. We're also, I state that to say that we're also in the very early stages of discussion, which we haven't really even briefed our state consultants on yet, about potentially looking at bringing running commuter rail from St. Johns County to Jacksonville. And obviously that, whether we work with private sector, it would potentially be a public-private partnership, whatever it may be, those discussions are now picking up. So knowing that we've got these 2 big projects, the U2C and commuter rail, potentially coming down the pipeline, the governor's office will be a big piece of helping to fund those projects. And so talk to us a little bit about your relationship with the governor's office and any thoughts that you might have surrounding those 2 larger projects. And again, I know you don't have much on the commuter piece right now, but just wanted to understand, because we know obviously the governor has a lot of power with his veto pen after it gets through the legislature, whether we have to go for a one-off to get it funded, and the legislature is how we do that. We certainly are always concerned about, once those line items make it to the governor's office, getting them across the finish line. So just wanted to hear from you all on kind of the governor's side, because we certainly know the power that you have on the legislative side. And by the way, I'm going to ask all the consultants going through this same question.
Okay, let me, Brian, you still on? Brian? No. Okay. Let me give it a shot, because obviously you got a lot there, a lot on your plate, and you guys know how the 5-year work program works. It's the mill of the gods, and it clanks over very slowly, but it works in terms of phases, when the phases come up, how they come up. If you talk about a road, it's PD&E, it's right away, it's all the clearances for utilities, and then it's finally construction. So I think it's important, number one, that we have a clear understanding of the amount of the project, the total amount, and how you plan to kind of fashion that out. And I know that's in the process. But then you have to have a lot of education in the process to the people that we work with and daily, the transportation committee chairman and the guys in the governor's office. So we have and Brian would tell you that we have an excellent working relationship with the governor's office. And we would start, I think, with the educational process with your delegation, you know, and now the iron is pretty hot with, you know, Bradley and Cummings sitting in the seat. They're going to be, that process turns over every 2 years too, so we're going to lose those two guys. But I think it's important in the process, you know, my relationship with Kevin Tebow, relationship with the district office, my relationship with the work program thing. I think it's important that we start now to educate people on what the plan is, what the various elements of the plan, how they're laid out in terms of cost, and really the educational process has got to start. And we've got to have a good shepherd for that process. Nat is doing a great job of creating a vision of what JTA is all about in terms of regional concepts, but we got to get him in front of people to talk about, you know, these projects, the UTC project, your rail projects, the things that you're doing, so that we can start nipping away at the work program to fund some of this stuff. But it all starts at the very bottom. I mean, you guys know how this process works, but we need a champion. We need a champion through the process, starting with Nat, getting in front of the governor's office, getting in front of whoever the transportation chairman are, getting in front of, I think it starts with Kevin Tebow, quite frankly. I think it starts with, you know, Drummond, who is the chief engineer over there. I think it starts with the very top of the legislative process, the very top of the DOT. Kevin Tebow has been around the block. You guys know that guy. I know him back from when he was with the Turnpike Enterprise. But it's got to be something that's a priority for this area. It's got to be a real educational process about what your vision is for these projects, and then it's got to be a well thought out, you know, combination of funding, the DOT trust fund, combination of federal dollars and local dollars. I mean, you guys know how it works. We've got to just get over there and put our nose to the grindstone.
And to answer your question specifically, I'm in the governor's office weekly, if not multiple times during the committee weeks. I think it's important to look at the governor's office right now too is very fluid. Obviously, we have great relationships with the governor. We were heavily involved with his election and heavily involved in the transition, and still involved. Shane Strom is an old friend to many of us, which is not hard to say in Tallahassee.
Yeah.
Obviously, everybody's got a connection to Shane. He's a great guy. He was actually, I first met Shane when he was a client. He worked for a client that we had, and I worked extensively with Shane on some projects. And so it's great to see him come back, kind of full circle back into that fold. I think the other thing to look at with the governor's office is the tenure and the age of the level right below Shane. You know, you got a lot of guys right in their early 30s, maybe even late 20s. I'm not even sure the ages anymore. So you're going to see some turnover, and projects that you're talking about are going to be years in the making. It's not a simple, hey, we had a great meeting and it's going to be on your desk in 3 months. But obviously I see David Clark, the new chief of staff, deputy chief of staff, quite often. I saw him last week. Adrian Lucas is a very good friend as well. In fact, actually just was in there last week and said, hey, you need to update the organizational chart, guys, because I'm not sure which department falls under everybody yet. And they're like, oh, we haven't updated that yet? I'm like, no. So I'm just here to kind of, I know who I need to see, but just so you know, the public doesn't know where the new silos are, you still have James Blair listed. And of course, Stephanie over in Legislative Affairs, obviously, I mean, even though it says Legislative Affairs, she's basically a deputy chief of staff, and nobody's gonna know more transportation issues than she does coming from her background. With that said, I do a ton of appropriation work, and Johnny is absolutely right. It won't be as simple as worrying about the veto pen. The veto pen, you really worry about the ornaments, you know, the $500 to $2 million projects that are kind of riddled throughout there. What you're talking about are giant buckets in a even bigger silo that aren't going to get to the governor if you don't have the legislative buy-in. And that's going to happen through a collective push from the entire area by leaning on the mayor to make sure the mayor has made this a priority when he talks to the governor, which I'm involved with quite often with the mayor and the governor. So Johnny's absolutely right in that everybody needs to be pushing the same rock up the same hill, and then it's just consistent, steady messaging over time. I do think this governor is doing a fantastic job, and obviously he is no stranger to rolling out new policy initiatives. There's a major announcement every single week, and what you're talking about is a major announcement. It is a major policy shift, and so I think you have the right audience there already. You just, when you do gotta make sure you deliver the right message to the governor. But it sounds like if you guys can get the messaging right and get everybody on board from your local area, it's the kind of thing the governor's going to want to definitely put his muscle behind. With that said, obviously, it's a three-legged stool. And even if the governor thinks it's a great idea, you're seeing it right now with his push for teacher pay. Nobody's going to say they're against it, but at the same time, they're like, I don't necessarily have whatever that price tag is set aside for this. So it's a multi-year project that involves not only pushing the governor's office, but not forgetting those two other legs. And those other legs are arguably more fluid than the governor's office. Because of term limits, it's great if the current appropriations chair likes it. What you need to be worried about is 4 years from now with the appropriations chair.
And you guys know how this works. You can go in and start, giving a broad overview of things that are coming up through the process for JTA. But when you lock on stuff like this, you got to have a specific goal of that particular. You can't, we have projects that come through the process, just like Matt says, where you fill out this form and you get $1 million, you get a $2 million, you get $3 million here. That, I know this is a lot of money, but you're talking about big buckets of money. We're talking about long-term, year after year, shepherding through the process, not $1 million, not $2 million. We're talking about very large projects that the DOT has got to buy into, quite frankly. The districts have got to buy into that process. It's not like you can just go over there and fill out a form and say, I need $1 million to refurbish a ferry or a dock. I mean, this is huge stuff that's got to be a giant educational process. And Matt's right. People like David Clark, who is absolutely a star in the making. I knew David when he was over at DEP as the lands guy, when he was at Department of Management Services, when he was doing procurement type stuff, when he was trying to change little cultural things like proof of concept for IT stuff. So this guy's a visionary. He's a guy we can talk to. And then Luke Adrian is just a guy that's worked in the legislative process. He knows the roots and canals of the process. He knows how to do a staff analysis. He knows the politics of. So we have excellent relationships with the two deputies, and who knows where those guys will end up. But David Clark's going to be an agency head. I mean, he is going to be an agency head. So it's a guy that we know now, we've known in the past, and he's going to be something. So these are projects that you need somebody to dig into and start, doing the educational process, like I said.
So a follow-up question on that, Johnny. I adhere to the comments that Jessica made on worker bee and you always keeping us aware, and I can attest to that, and Jessica as well. So we really appreciate everything that you've done and you do for us. That we've been, as you mentioned, we were successful in a couple of appropriations, but our bread and butter has always been trying to circumvent that and going to the department to identifying different pots of money and different sources. While the administration and this DOT continues to move more into the mobility integration space or innovation, they've not been as quick as others. So you mentioned in the beginning the legislature is for appropriate money and policy. How do we start tackling and going to what Jess says, that $300 million project using as example? We do need to start thinking about the pots of money, trust funds, others that there's inside the department to fit these type of projects that cross our multimodal, our mobility, are not the rail or the public transit bus at Coven shop. how do we start relaying that message and probably creating that sense that then this could be the administration that really takes a couple of those olds and brings them into one umbrella to move forward those mobility, multimodal, regional, innovative technology projects? Tough one.
That's a tough
Big one.
Yeah. Well, you know, we could, you know, policy and appropriations can go hand in hand. We've seen that in the SIS program, the Strategic Intermodal System. We've seen that in some of the right-of-way programs. We've seen it in some of the, you know, trying to tie, you know, real policy to the financial structure. I can visualize it would take, again, you know, a pretty heavy lift, but I can visualize, you know, going back and thinking about how hard it was to even carve out, you know, transit as a dedicated source of funding from the big pot. If you remember, it was just, you know, in policy saying that a minimum of 15% will be used for, you know, transit. I visualize taking maybe that 15% and saying that it's 25%, and maybe 5% of the 25% is a carve out for projects that you mentioned, because you got to highlight, you know, through policy, and then you got to designate through policy a designated fund source. And I go back as an example and say the SIS program, you know, the law in 339 says that 75% will go to, of capacity funds will go to the SIS program. Maybe you take part of that and carve out a piece like the 15%, like the SIS, and say that you have this paragraph that says you have a program, a BRT program, a rail program, and I will tell you that I've been working in transportation a long time, and when you say rail, high-speed rail or any types of rail, you know, people go into some kind of shakes. You know, they don't, you know, especially Brandis, and you guys have heard it. So you'd have to talk about it and figure out what the words would actually say, and then you would actually designate, you know, as a carve out. And I know that's a word that's not used very much, but between us here, you'd have to designate along with those words, like the SIS, like the 15 for transit, you'd have to designate a part of that to go to funding, so that DOT in the work program development, when they do the allocations, when they go through the process of doing, you know, an allocation for the districts for construction, an allocation for districts for transit, an allocation for transit in general, it would have to be tied to that specific. That's the way I would do it. I would just definitely write the policy, whatever you're trying to do, and then I would designate. I would go directly to 339 and say, you know, this much money or percentage of the money of X would go directly to that program. Does that make sense?
And then to put it simpler also, well, that's the nuts and bolts, but you got to get the legislators that want to do it.
Well, education.
And so, yeah, it's. I always explain, you want to explain to the elected officials the end result, and don't worry about it. Johnny and I are going to talk to FTLT and explain to you how to get there. But at the end of the day, here's what the results are going to be. You're going to have less traffic on your roadway. You're going to have better workforce transportation. You're going to explain all these. I always joke with all my clients, appropriations work is very easy. It's you have a square peg and you've got to find a square hole for it. And if the square hole isn't there, you have to create that square hole. And so you basically are going to, talk to those elected officials to make sure they realize the benefit of what you're trying to accomplish to create that policy goal. And so when FDOT is then looking for, like, I need something to fit in this square hole because the legislators have told me they want this as a priority to them. And they go, hey, guess what? We have a square peg right here. And that's when success meets everything Johnny just said.
And also you have to, every time we get into a discussion of the pot, if you will, the state transportation pot, the general revenue pot, we start having discussions about equity. And you know what equity is? If I get more than you, it's equitable. So, your program has got to be, it's got to be competitive where everybody that's got, and so it's going to have to go through that hoop too. So, the good thing is that, we know the process, we know the steps, but the hard thing is going in with the educational process, the actual program, and who the pot is only so big. So who's going to be the winner and who's going to be the loser unless you have a new revenue source. And so, it's my thought right here and now. It was you would take, right now the transit money says a minimum of 15%. We know that the work program is getting more than 15% for transit. So that number probably now is in the neighborhood of 20 to 25%. Maybe that number needs to be 30, and part of that needs to be to some program. Then you get into the fight with the highway people and the fight with the rail people and the fight with everybody else. And so it's not an easy answer, but that is a start, and that is the start of the discussion, because you got to deal with the pot of money, and you got to deal with the losers and the winners, and because the pot's not going to grow. You guys have seen, the new MCORs that we've got now. How is that funded? Well, they took revenue out of the general revenue fund that are traditionally going to transportation, and they just gave it back to transportation. The pot has got to be massaged, and you got to have winners, and you got to have losers, and you got to have, how you going to deal with that issue too. So it's not easy, but that's
what we do. That's how we make a living,
that's
to be
what
honest.
That's what we do.
Richard, do you have anything?
No, they've answered most of what, you guys brought up the
Yeah.
big
your
looming
piece.
issues, yeah.
All right, well, we really appreciate your time. Thank you for making the drive-in. Greatly appreciate it. And hopefully we'll be back in touch soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.